Share this story if it moved you. The horizon around Redwell was a serrated ribbon of rust and bone, a scar in the earth that split the sky where the sun baked the mesas into flat coins of light. Redwell was the kind of place you could ride past a dozen times and never notice, just another sun-creased stop between El Paso and the emptier stretches of the territory, unless you had business there. The rusted lantern sat in the town's center like a black tooth, weathered wood, a hand-painted sign swaying on a single iron hinge, a bell that never stopped ringing and never seemed to ring when it should. People came for the whiskey, the poker, and the quiet agreement that certain truths were not to be discussed past midnight. The town thrummed on the illusion that power was measured in acres and silver, and in Redwell that illusion had been carefully tended for generations. June Marlowe moved through the rusted lantern like a shadow with a purpose. Barely 18, she worked the back kitchen, arms dusted with flour and her dark braid tucked beneath a linen scarf. She tied her apron the same way each morning, a knot practiced until it was as much ritual as habit, and the small pressed wildflower she never washed off her cheek had become as much a part of her as the dust on her boots. June's smile was shy and patient, made for mending cuts and handing out plates. The men who came through the saloon saw a girl who could make a biscuit like an apology and boil beans like a benediction. They did not see what had been hammered into her by long river days and an old man's stubborn lessons. Her grandfather, Silas Marlowe, had been a legend on the riverboats that once threaded the swollen Mississippi, feared, loved, and bankrolled by a roll of women and saints. He'd taught June to read more than cards. He taught her to read people. "A deck tells the truth of itself, girl," Silas would say, voice like gravel and honey. "But a man, he'll give you his story with his hands, his throat, the way his lids drop when he learns to hide." By 11, June could tell a lie in a gambler's breath and know the reason for it. When fever took Silas in a boarding house far from Redwell, and a winter took her mother not long after, June folded their lessons and their few possessions into her chest. The only asset that mattered now was a deed. The Marlowe homestead, 40 acres of hard land outside Redwell, bought by her mother with sweat and a stubborn refusal to leave. It was sinking under back taxes. June took the kitchen job to keep the homestead out of strangers' hands. She never touched cards in public, not even when ranchers with more swagger than sense dared her to cut the deck for sport. Grandfather had a way of saying things that lodged under skin. "You got a gift. Guard it. Don't let it be a sideshow for men who only know the cost of noise." So she kept her hands in dough and stew and listened. Listening was how people revealed themselves. The rusted lantern was as much a study hall as it was a saloon. Under clouds of cigar smoke and amid the clatter of chips, stories were told and almost always believed. And then Thaddeus Crane walked through the doors with boots from an eastern money loom and a stack of silver that made the barkeep's eyes go soft. Thaddeus was the town's crown prince, a third-generation rancher whose land spread in a quiet, greedy tide across the counties, whose handshake could make a man whole and whose smile could ruin reputations. He hosted Friday nights in the back room of the Rusted Lantern, games for men who counted themselves the town's backbone. They played under gaslight, hands worth a worker's yearly pay, shifting in the same breath as tossed insults and offered bets. The game was tradition and spectacle, a place to rehearse power. "Let one of the girls watch tonight," Thaddeus suggested, as if he were proffering entertainment for an idle crowd. "Maybe that kitchen slip of a thing. June, wasn't it? Give the boys something to laugh at." Mabel Hargrove, owner of the Rusted Lantern, looked at him with a razor in her voice. Mabel was a widow with a spine like a crowbar and a face that had long ago stopped entertaining fools. "This ain't a circus, Crane," she said, and the words landed soft but final. June heard everything, of course. Walls in Redwell were porous in their own way. She kept moving, serving plates, the world slipping around the edges of her days like dust in a sunbeam. That Friday, June entered the back room with a tray of smoked beef and found the poker table full of men who thought they had already written the night's script. Thaddeus tipped his hat and winked as if he had arranged a spectacle. June set the tray down and left, only to slip back later with a jug of rye. She stood behind Thaddeus like a shadow and watched. Men expected her to watch like a curiosity. They expected the entertainment of a young thing who would titter and admire. June watched instead. The first hand made the usual noise. Cards whispering, chips clinking, whiskey offering itself like sacrament. By the third hand, she wasn't simply observing. She was collecting the room in her head. One tell at a time, each man speaking with muscle and breath. Judge Harrow blinked when a winning card came his way and pressed a thumb against his lip like a man clearing calluses. Dr. Alden Pierce rubbed the edge of his palm when he bluffed. For him, the beard scratch came 3 ticks before the lie. Thaddeus, broad and brash, had a showman's flop. He banged his palm on the table when he thought he had the hand. On the 5th hand, Thaddeus threw a full house onto the felt with a flourish that begged for applause. June, who had kept her hands to pots and pans all her life, stepped into the light with a small cloth pouch in her apron pocket. 2 years of savings, so much and so little. She put it on the table and spoke in a voice that surprised even her. "I'd like a seat," she said. Laughter filled the room at first. The easy, "yes, we are men" laughter, until it didn't. The judge coughed. A few men whooped. Others glanced, mild curiosity uncoiling into something sharper. Thaddeus leaned forward with a smile shaped like a predator's patience. "Well, girl, let's give you a chair," he said. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to see a girl humiliated for daring. By night's end, the sound louder than the clink of June's winnings was the silence that replaced it, the stunned quiet of men discovering an expectation had been overturned. She had read them as Silas had taught her, not by the pattern the cards laid, but by the way men lived inside themselves when stakes moved. She made stacks into neat towers, with the sort of calm that didn't trumpet victory. Mabel, who'd watched from the doorway, didn't clap. Her expression carried something more complicated, an odd mixture that might have been pride laced with the concern of someone who knew the world could pivot on a coin toss, and that pivot often came with teeth. Word spread like lightning in dry grass. June's name stopped being attached to stew pots and broom closets. In rooms that still thought of women as background scenery, her victory became discomforting truth. Ranch hands, bankers, ministers, people who had been certain of their place, now looked over their shoulders at someone who had once poured them coffee. Thaddeus's smile turned thin. He still tipped his hat, but the easy condescension had hardened into calculation. June continued her work as if the floorboards would swallow her if she made anything other than her route through the kitchen. But the coin in her apron pocket felt heavier now. She slipped the winnings under a loose floorboard in her room where it could do the work of a promise. Pay the taxes, maybe buy time, maybe buy the land back from the court's hungry teeth. Not every attention was a benediction. Boone Reed, the saloon's quiet protector with shoulders like an oaken beam, found June with a note folded in a palm-worn hand. No name, 1 town, 3 words, fold while you can. Boone's voice when he told Mabel made her eyes narrow. "You ever hear a name like Blackwell?" she asked. It landed like a stone in June's stomach. Silas had said the name once in a way that made the room grow colder. "He don't play cards," Silas had muttered. "He plays men. When he loses, his enemies tend not to stick around." Gideon Blackwell arrived not with swagger, but with a steady, quiet menace. He tied his horse with the kind of precision that belongs to men who never forgot a thing. Neat knot, measured steps, all the small actions of a life that had practiced control. He ordered a drink, paid in new coins that glittered like contempt, and set a folded parchment on the bar. He had come for June, with the courtesy of an executioner scheduling a time. The parchment read as a challenge. 1 game, winner takes all. Gideon placed the Marlowe homestead on the table on his terms. If June refused, the paper whispered he had ways to take. Mabel, Thaddeus, a judge, and the sheriff sat anchored around the back room as if fate required an audience. Boone Reed became a living hinge at the door. Neighbors took their seats with hands folding inside their coats, and June found herself clutching the worn coin the way a believer might clutch a rosary. The deed to her mother's land was folded inside her apron, everything she owned held in a small square of paper, and a woman's stubborn refusal to leave the land that belonged to her family. June wasn't a gambler to show off. She had never desired that stage. But the stakes were not only dirt and fence boards. This was ownership of her life, of the story her mother had seeded in a lean patch of prairie. If Gideon thought he could intimidate her into yielding, he had misread something elemental. She had been taught to play the man, not just the hand. Her grandfather had taught that power took shape in the small things, a pause, a flick of the eye, the way a man tapped the rim of his glass when he was lying to himself. Gideon, smooth with an edge like broken glass, had a deck that gleamed too clean. Thaddeus, who liked to pretend he understood every ledger and face in the territory, muttered about marked cards and tricks. Hayes, no Thaddeus, gave June a look that for a moment blurred ownership and shame into something else: regret. The rules were set. 5-card stud, no mercy. Gideon dealt with a professional's blandness, offering June his deck as if he were simply sharing a common utility rather than a concealed engine. June handled the cards like she handled knives in the kitchen, with care, a quiet reverence, and a mind that cataloged subtlety. She watched the men not for theatrics, but for speech. Gideon's finger tapped once before each deal. A faint mark on a corner of the cards glinted only to someone who had spent childhood learning to read the texture of paper and the heat of palms. The first hand went as most beginning hands do. June let it pass, folding deliberately, buying information. The second hand tested Gideon's patience. By the third hand, she had located the mark on his deck, a whisper of substance beneath the varnish. It was a tiny thing, a smear where wax had caught the grain, and in Gideon's manner of glancing at it, June saw the architecture of his confidence. Cheaters build systems around fear. They train partners and tricks. They make the room speak to their advantage. But systems crack when someone sees the scaffolding. June began to replay his moves against him. She mirrored his bets, dipped into pretend uncertainty, and let her face become a mirror of his assumptions. When she raised on a weak hand and held her breath like an offering, he leaned in, thinking he smelled weakness. He bet as if the deck told him stories he alone could read. He called as if his men had taught him not to fear exposure. The room started to tilt with tension the way a scale leans when more weight is slowly pressed onto one side. By the fifth hand, the game had shed its performative skin and turned into something raw and exact. June played slow, patient, letting Gideon set the pace until he had committed. Mind, money, and ego. She knew the rhythm of his desperation before he admitted it to himself. The swallow, the fraction of a blink, the tightening of the fist around the last chip. The turn came, a 10 of hearts, and June felt the air around her press inward. Her hand held queen, king, ace of hearts, 3 hearts that hummed like a promise when the right cards came. The possibility of a royal flush lay on the horizon, like the distant crown of a mountain. Gideon pushed all in with emotion that was both challenge and confession. June matched him with a calm that could have been arrogance if it weren't earned. The river card fell, Jack of hearts, and the room stopped as if someone had slammed its door. Queen, king, ace, 10, jack, the perfect arc of a royal flush. The sound that followed was a long inhalation that carried the town's secrets with it. Gideon turned over his cards, a full house, massive under another sun, but not the sun burning now. June revealed her hand, the 5 hearts like a sealed verdict. No argument slipped from Gideon's lips. He did not stand on his feet. He did not call for help. He sat and folded inward like a man who'd realized that the game he'd rigged had been undone by the thing he could not control. Another person's dignity and skill. It wasn't a scream of triumph that followed. It was a new kind of silence, the steady, clean sound of a shift. June took what belonged to her, not with gloating, but with an anatomy of restraint that felt like grace. Mabel's eyes shone with something dangerous. The acceptance that the order of things had been rearranged. Boone Reed closed the door and leaned his back against the frame like a sentinel at the turning of the tide. Thaddeus, who had come to see the spectacle of a woman humbled, now rode at the edge of something that resembled respect. In the weeks that followed, the Marlowe homestead became not merely a place but an argument laid down in timber and stone. The debt was cleared. People who had laughed, tacked up signs, and picked up hammers without being asked. One-room schoolhouse plans were pulled from the marrow of June's mother's memory and set into motion with board and nail. The fences were mended by hands that once thought their worth measured only in acres. Even Thaddeus brought the final plank for the school porch, with a slow step that suggested a man learning to be better rather than simply less proud. News of Gideon Blackwell's defeat spread further than Redwell's dusty lanes. It traveled to towns that had long folded men like Gideon into their myths. Honest players began asking for oversight and calling out marked decks. Small towns, which had been taught to believe power was the natural order, found themselves rehearsing a new belief. Courage and integrity could topple systems built on fear. Women who had been relegated to doorways began to imagine tables where they might set down their elbows. The name June Marlowe moved through post offices and churches like an invitation or a dare. Standing at the edge of her land one early morning, June watched the prairie rise and fall under the breath of the wind. The oak tree beside the fragile schoolhouse cast a long finger of shade over the packed earth, and in that stillness she heard the echo of Silas's final lesson, the one he had left unsaid, but lived out in the way he held his cards and his heart. Victory, he had told her once, was not counting stacks, but choosing the table where your soul won't be bankrupt. She had chosen, and the shape of the world around her had changed because she had stayed. If one thing did not change, it was the quiet way June kept to small tasks, mending a fence, teaching a handful of children their letters, stirring a pot when volunteers came and sang in yards that had once been barren. She wore her apron still. She tied it in the same knot. But when she looked up from the bread she was kneading, there was a set to her jaw that had the memory of sharpened things. She'd learned that power could be held without spectacle, and that dignity was the real currency. Comment your favorite line. People across the territories began to tell the story in the way old weathered things become narratives. Certain lines were exaggerated, other parts softened for comfort. Some told it as an account of luck, others as a parable of bravery. June never claimed either version. She claimed the land and the quiet work of building a life worth staying for. Gideon Blackwell drifted out of Redwell like smoke that could not find a fire to hold. Some said he took refuge under a new name. Others said he became a cautionary tale at poker tables where new rules were posted and stacks were kept in plain sight. Men who had once believed that all rules were for other people learned the fallacy of such thinking. And Redwell changed, small and stubborn as it was. The rusted lantern cleaned the oil lamps more often. The judge sat straighter and listened better. The sheriff undertook what the law asked without smoothing its corners for the powerful. A schoolhouse sprang, a place where children learned sums and letters and, if they were lucky, the dignity of being taught by someone who had fought for a patch of earth. June, she kept the silver coin Silas had left her in a leather pouch in her pocket. Sometimes when a wind came in off the plains and lifted the skirt of the schoolhouse like a secret, she would press the coin to her palm and remember the way a man's tell can be as plain as a prayer. By the time the first autumn rolled over Redwell, bringing a cool that made people close doors early and light lamps sooner, June stood under the oak at the school's edge with a small group of kids and Mabel and Boone and even Thaddeus. The plaque above the little classroom read, Marlowe Homestead School, founded with grit, preserved by a town that learned it could be better. Underneath, in a smaller hand, June had requested the words read like a map to the kind of life she wanted for the land and for herself. Built on truth, defended with courage, remembered with grace. She had not sought glory. She had wanted the right to name the place where her family's hands had been buried, the right to teach the children who would follow how to read both a book and a man's face. She had wanted to keep a small plot of earth in her own name, and by doing that she had pressed a new seam into the world, one that would make it slightly harder for men like Gideon Blackwell to assume they owned everything. Years would teach the rest. In some places, Gideon's kind of man would reinvent himself and return in new guises. Greed is a weed that finds fresh soil. But Redwell had learned an important thing, that the cost of maintaining illusions of supremacy was higher than the price of rebuilding them honestly. The rusted lantern's back room saw fewer marked decks. The poker tables found a cleanliness that made men uncomfortable at first and better citizens later. June never stopped sweeping the floor, never stopped tying that same knot in her apron, never stopped folding the deeds and the lessons into the small square of her life. She rode sometimes to town to buy seeds or to pick up a bucket of nails. She visited the grave of Silas with a rose she kept in a jar by her window. Her hands knew both dough and deck now, but what she used them for more often were repairs and lessons, building more than taking. When people arrived at Redwell looking for the girl who had once won a hand in a back room, they found a woman who carried a margin of patience and a memory of humility. They found a school and a homestead and a town that had begun to believe in a future a little less crooked. If you believe in stories that turn the underdog into something who changes tides, if you've ever been underestimated only to turn the table in ways no one foresaw, tell someone this story. Tell it as a warning or a benediction. Tell it because sometimes the world needs reminding that courage, intelligence, and a steady hand can do what money and menace cannot. Subscribe or follow for more.